May the words of my lips and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Please be seated. Today's Gospel begins with the words, "The kingdom is as if." The kingdom is as if. It's about the kingdom, and the as if reminds us that the listeners that a parable will follow. We've already had other parables in Matthew's Gospel, and here comes yet another parable. The kingdom is as if. What will follow is a story, not a true story, but a story which can contain truth or truths. As a child, I certainly remember when we were talking about the parables, we were given a very specific interpretation. However, as I've grown a bit older and I hope a bit wiser, I have considered the parables rather differently. And I'm certainly drawn back to the fact that when Jesus told a parable, he very rarely explained what it was about. He left the hearers to make their own conclusions. And that, for me, is one of the great gifts, one of the great beauties of parables. If I had been a high-powered financier and heard this parable, I might say, God is telling me to invest my money wisely. However, if I had been sitting with a group of people who were discussing their gifts and abilities, I might have thought it was referring to that, the use of gifts and abilities. Equally, if I were someone whose time was short, say someone for whom they had been given a diagnosis that the end of their life was near, my attitude to this parable would be different. It could be a question about how am I going to use aright the time that is left to me here on earth, words from one of our funeral services. So, as I pondered on this gospel, two questions came to me. What sort of a kingdom is the kingdom that is being talked about, being spoken about, being written about in the passages of Scripture that we have today? So what sort of a kingdom is it? And what is expected of the citizens of that kingdom? Looking at the gospel, the kingdom is one where God is in charge. Difficult, particularly in difficult times, to remember this, that God is in charge. If we look at the man in that parable and think that man may represent God, then God is in charge. There is also a rather difficult message in that gospel, which is that the servant who didn't use the gift, the talents, which was a considerable amount of money, he didn't use it at all, he was punished. So there's a God who's in charge, but there's also, at some level, we need to be accountable to God for how the talents are used. If we look at the Zephaniah reading, the title for that for me would be, "What a Terrible Day." What a terrible day. There's a lot of gloom and doom in that Zephaniah reading which we had. And yet, the beginning of that says, "Listen, be silent." So it's reminding us that sometimes we have to listen. It may be an admonition. It may be something that we have done wrong. It may be to listen in silence to hear what God's saying to us. So listening. Moving on to the Psalm 90, which we didn't read today, but is set for today. That is a very different psalm. It's believed to be a prayer of Moses for the shelter of the Most High, a prayer for the shelter of the Most High. And it begins with the words, "Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations, from everlasting to everlasting. Lord, you have been our dwelling place." So it's a kingdom where there is a God who is a dwelling place. That to me speaks of a home, of warmth, of comfort, of hospitality. And God is that dwelling place, not just for the present, for the past, the present, and the future. And in that kingdom, the citizens are reminded to count their days, that they may gain a wise heart. Count their days, that they may gain a wise heart. Moving on to the Thessalonians passage, those in the kingdom are to keep awake, to be ready. We have the strong image of Jesus' return, which was expected very soon, coming like a thief in the night. So the people are to be prepared. And they are reminded in that reading that they belong to the light, and that they are to encourage one another and build up each other as indeed they are doing. I like to take the word courage out of the word encourage and emphasize courage, something that I certainly pray for from time to time. So going back to the questions, what sort of a kingdom is it? It is a kingdom who has God who is in charge. The people in the kingdom are to be accountable. God is a dwelling place. God is to be listened to, and God expects us to encourage one another. And what are the characteristics of the citizens? They are to be faithful, they are to be prepared, and they are to be courageous. That may well mean perhaps being ready to take risks. So as we begin a new week, may we be strengthened, guided to be faithful, prepared, and courageous, to be a continuing part of this kingdom. And may God add his blessing to these words.